Hey guys, my name is Surya and welcome to Everything Cyber. In today's episode, we'll be looking into the space of security in a software supply chain. This is usually a complex environment where we're managing multiple packages and code, whether it be internal or external. And we thought this episode would be super useful to all folk in cyber, and also if you're a developer in general. So, whether you're an AppSec engineer, an architect, or even a dev, today's episode is for sure going to have some valuable information for you. In this episode, we initially spoke about the state of a security supply chain, and then later we moved more into like how supply chain is being managed, what are the lack of incentives that are there, and even in the end, look at some of the visibility issues in supply chain. To finish off the episode, we went over some of the predictions that we had for the future of a supply chain. If you found this episode helpful, then we kindly request you to share this with your friends. Please feel free to leave a comment. If this is your first time listening to us, thank you. We would really appreciate a subscriber or a follower in whatever platform you're listening. And let's head right into the episode. So, hey Kev.
Hello. Hey, Surya.
How's it going?
And hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Everything Cyber.
Hi guys.
This is episode number
6.
Yes. And in today's episode, we are talking about what is making our software supply chain so vulnerable. So we're going to look at from a security aspect and talk about things like what are the main reasons behind we are seeing so many attacks in the recent past, right? So all the way from our SolarWinds, Log4j, all the big name attacks to even the smaller scale attacks we have. Why are they being so prevalent and why so suddenly?
Yep.
So yeah, Surya, this is a very interesting topic to me because it's in every other industry, even if it's somewhat as complicated as the software industry we have, they have a pretty research that and information that goes into the supply chain. Whereas up until very recently, the concept of securing the supply chain wasn't a very common term, right? If we look back something like 2020 or even like early 2021, there wasn't so much talk about securing the supply chain. But fast forward now, it's one of the main issues a lot of people are dealing with, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, what changed and what is making our supply chain so vulnerable and why are we talking about now?
Yeah, I think you hit the point. Basically, I remember back in 2017 listening to a DEF CON talk on software supply chain, like someone saying, hey, this is like an attack vector that's being used. People knew about it. It's been there for a while, but it's been brought more into the spotlight recently. I think in general, in today's modern world and modern dev environments, we just use more packages than ever before. So yeah, before we had like Java with like certain dependencies with like Spring or certain frameworks if you use, but in today with like projects like using npm and so on, it's just much easier to both ingest and deploy packages itself. And I would probably estimate that in the current environments for developers, probably are using over 80% of the code from packages or other external sources, right? Whether it be internal or external. And you could say like 20% of the rest of the code is roughly written by the devs itself. And this then brings us to the next point, like who is writing this 80% of the code, right? Who? I think that's a big question mark on that, right?
Anyone and everyone.
Anyone and everyone, pretty much, right? Open source, so it ends up being like usually open source projects, and these open source projects usually do not have many strong security controls. We have seen issues where people can ingest some malicious code into it, right? And the maintainers are like, oh, cool, it sorts the issue. Let me publish it, right? There, like, not everyone in the open source community is like super into security. They're just devs trying to, showcase their skills within the project sometimes, or just try to maintain it, when it gets too big. Yeah, that's I would say is like the current state of supply chain and
I would say
specific packages.
You've definitely hit a very good point there, because one of the common and very interesting kinds of attacks I've seen recently, which was, I wouldn't name the package, but it is a popular package, where what basically happened with that NPM package is the NPM package got compromised by the attacker when they offered the developers like a few $100 to transfer the ownership of the package, right? And when you're doing open source software, it is very rarely you're seeing any kind of monetary benefits. So it's very rare to have that financial kickback from your projects. And fair so, a lot of people do not even expect that. And which leads us to this issue of the incentives to maintain that, right? A lot of people start an open source project because they're learning to code, they want to give back to the community, they want to upskill themselves. But what requires people to maintain for a long period of time without any kind of kickback, it's very hard to do so, right? So that's where I see a lot of these open source systems are definitely being quite vulnerable to, because what you mentioned of they not having proper security controls is definitely one thing, but also the lack of incentives to put in that effort to make them secure is another. That's one of the big pain points of open source security, I feel, as well. Another aspect of open source software is we have this notion that, oh, it's open source, that means a lot of eyes have gone over it, so that means people are security reviewing it, etc., etc. Which is true to some degree, but at the same time, I feel like when it comes to open source software, it's not, security, like we mentioned, is not a high priority. People are just wanting to make it work as soon as possible. And because of that, and similarly, people just don't care. There's not a lot of people who thinks that, okay, in my free time today, I'm just going to go and review the security of this open source package, right? That very rarely happens. So that notion of, oh, open source software automatically translates to more secure is falling apart. We had this concept going around quite a bit, right? It's open source, it's more secure, but we quickly understand that that wasn't the case. And on the flip side, it's actually much easier for the hacker to analyze the code, to see through the vulnerabilities, and then exploit the package. So yeah, that's one of the another big issues. I think the security supply chain, our software supply chain, is really suffering from a security standpoint.
I would say also, like, who is contributing to the code, right? Who? So whether it be a group of organizations like who are partnering to maintain this open source project, like Chromium and so on, or whether it's a funded open source project that's being used, or sometimes just being run by some enthusiasts, right? So, and also sometimes us as community members just go and contribute code. And this allows another attack vector where basically you could have a state-sponsored attack, like space-sponsored contributor. Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Fake mustaches.
Who basically will, like, ingest a malicious code, and he's like, I'm just like scrolling through the code, and I'm like, okay, cool, that looks good to me. It fixes the bug, so let's go. Click commit and like just push it, and then you see like there's like now vulnerability that's exploitable, right? And then boom, that just gets pushed. The package object just gets pushed to millions of users who are using that package. Then it goes into the dev environments and then gets published into the applications, right? So that gives the state-sponsored attack so much power on how they can affect the landscape of applications. Right?
It's changing dynamics, right? Because if you think about it, 10 years ago, this notion of APTs, state-backed attackers going and contributing to open source softwares that in return are being downloaded by hundreds, thousands, and sometimes even millions of different code repositories. It's just something unique and so mind-boggling. Who would have thought that going forward 5-10 years we would have issues like this, right? Because if you look at the number of packages, and if you look at the packages throughout the time for JavaScript or Python 5 years ago or a couple of years ago versus now, we would definitely see a meteoric rise in the number of packages available. When we are trying to code, especially when I am trying to make something happen, right? I'll put down my developer hat. I'll put down my security hat for a bit and put on my developer hat. When I'm scavenging through the internet, scavenging through Google, scavenging through Stack Overflow, and trying to figure out how to make this piece of code work, security is not necessarily the top of my mind. The first thing is I Google something, I see a Stack Overflow response, and the first answer or whatever the verified answer is, there's a library for this, and you use library like this to achieve whatever you are trying to do. And I'm like, great, I copy paste that code, import that library, and I'm good to go. Right? So I don't have that habit of going and verifying that, okay, whether that library has issues or anything like that. So it is not in our developer culture or developer nature, quote unquote, to think about security, especially from a package and third party dependency when we're actually building it. That comes sort of in the aftermath or after it's an afterthought, right?
It's like we assume that the package is secure. We're giving our trust to these third parties, and in many cases, when don't copy on this, I used to do my assignments in uni. Sometimes I'm using some packages, right, and they were not being even maintained for the last year. So if it was vulnerable, it was vulnerable. It's not being updated, and anyone could exploit it openly.
I am guilty of that for uni projects as well. Whatever makes it work, man.
Yes, exactly. Right, and like that same mindset can flow over to a dev environment, whether it be a small company or even a large enterprise itself, right? And all it takes, as I said before, is like a single weak link, right? That can break open your environment in general. I think the other point that I had was on like industry-based frameworks, right? In general, when I went over multiple parts of the industry scouring for like a framework, there's nothing that's like widely adopted because it's such I would not say it's a new phenomenon, but it's like something that's been brought to the spotlight recently, right? So industry frameworks are just starting to build up, and industry collaboration is, I feel like, still behind. Like, do you have any points to add on that?
Yeah, of course. I feel like even at our company, right? So we are trying to implement this something called SLSA, which pretty much it's an initiative by a lot of companies as well as the OpenSSF, which is pretty much safeguarding our software supply chain, right? And the software supply chain has different aspects to it. We have all the way from the source code, the building of the source code, the third-party dependency that feeds in, the packages that are then deployed to the customers, right? This whole pipeline has so many issues and so many attack threats. And if you think about it, this is a very wide and open-ended problem. So before we didn't have that many frameworks, like you mentioned, it's still very premature and still the framework is being developed. And similarly, companies are still adopting it. I don't see a lot of non-large enterprises actually going after and implementing this. So there are frameworks like that, like the SLSA, or affectionately called SALSA. And SALSA has a few levels of those security supply chain assurance that you can do step by step, right, from level 1 to level 4. But the thing is that adopting this level 1 to level 4 is also not easy. So it's sort of tying back to that thing we mentioned before, that developers are not expected to, I mean, we will try our best to code securely, but that's not a given. That's not always expected. So how do we ensure the aftermath? How do we deal with the builds, deal with the package compilation and the package distribution, right? So it's still a very complicated problem, and that's where these kind of new frameworks are coming, but they're still much far away in terms of adoption. Similarly, another thing I think a lot of people should check out, and it's all mainstream knowledge, like companies like Google, they have their assured what was it? Assured open source software service or
Yeah.
something like that, where they vet certain packages and certain versions of packages, and I think it's a paid service. Don't quote me on it. I haven't checked into it, but you look into they basically do it on your behalf, because like any, I can just imagine how many open source projects Google themselves might rely on. So they do have the incentive to do so. So these kind of new frameworks and initiatives are popping up. I highly recommend people to look up OpenSSF if they're not familiar with. They are doing some amazing initiatives and work across the industry, and I'm really excited to see the type of work that's going to pop out of them in the next few years.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting. That also reminded me of something like recently I was looking at the newspapers and stuff, and heard about the software bill of materials that the Australian government is looking to implement.
Yes.
Yeah, SBOM as a legislature, right? And that's a very interesting topic in general, right? It's you have to provide a list of assets that you're using, and it also includes packages, right? And implementing that is going to be a big challenge for companies who do not have an asset list in general itself, right? Of like what packages they're using. So what are your thoughts in regards to that? Like, and how do you think company can go about it?
So the purpose behind SBOM is to bring transparency across the supply chain, right? So I have my ingress, people I'm feeding from, and then building my software or my service and feeding it to someone, right?
Yeah.
So building transparency across this supply chain is the purpose of SBOM, and which is a great initiative, but I do think there are certain issues with it as well, like things like what I think is a conflict of interest. SBOM is fine and dandy, it's gonna help people, but at the same time, if you ask me, a proprietary company, on, hey, how is your software built, that's also closely guarded knowledge, right? That's the secret source no one wants to give out. So companies will think twice before they put out this kind of information in the public. It is going to be beneficial, but obviously I do think, it's just my opinion, that from a company's perspective, there is some conflict of interest. So we will see some friction. Or what can some useful context I should add is, who is SBOM for, right? So far SBOM is kind of more for if you want to work with the government. So it's like a list of requirements government has. So unless you're working directly with the government, you are not so much incentivized to publish that, right? But then, as we know, the U.S. Department of Defense, or whatever, the U.S. government and the Australian government, all the major governments, they're big spenders on software, and everyone wants to be their customers. So we have a big list of vendors who are their customers. So it's a double-edged sword. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits of this, especially if we can properly accelerate the reporting process. That, hey, this is what I use, and if you use my software, this is pretty much you're signing up for, right? So it's like allergies. Like when you order food, you can see what ingredients are there, and if you have something like some kind of allergens, like if you have nut allergy, you can say that, oh, that's not acceptable by my standards, and I'm just not gonna
consume that. Basically.
And similarly, reporting of it. If something I was talking to a friend in the more, I think he's in the mechatronics / electrical engineering industry, and their supply chain standard, I feel like, is much more mature than me. And he said something like, oh, let's say a particular transistor, right? That transistor is being used by a wide range of companies, but let's say the manufacturer has found some fault in that transistor, and what they issue is like a callback, and everyone can just look up their bill of materials, not software bill of materials, whatever their supply chain bill of materials is. They go, oh, are we using that transistor? Yes, then pick that out and replace with something else.
Nice.
So that kind of transparency is really helpful, and I feel like that bringing that into the software world, it's going to be super helpful.
Yeah.
But yeah, that has some challenges that we
Challenges
talked
to it.
about.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I was thinking about like, it the first point I had in regards to it is in regards to visibility and asset management itself, right?
Mm.
Like you're a firm and you have no idea what packages you're using. Okay. You're in this state, right? And how do you
We're not talking about my firms, though,
Okay.
right? We're talking about general
in
firms.
general,
Just saying.
yeah, yeah. Like
Clarifying.
for example, XYZ firm, right?
Yeah. Okay.
We have a tool that's deployed, that an application that's deployed on SaaS, right? Like we have a SaaS-based solution, sorry, and then our devs are using packages from anywhere, external sources, and we also develop some own internal packages that can be used within devs. And then you're like, how do I get a list of assets, right? We saw like, so this company is basically like, oh, a log4j vulnerability came in, and they're like, oh, cool, I want to patch my systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh, I don't know what parts of my application actually use log4j, right? Where do I start, right? So the first step is for sure gaining visibility, but then how do you do that in a good and efficient way, right? Kev, you have any thoughts of that?
I would actually tie it back to the salsa, right?
Okay.
Because I think that was the $1 million question, because it is very hard to establish that visibility and that oversight and governance across the software supply chain, whereas frameworks like salsa are really the key in this case, because it gives you that step by step that you're not trying to do everything in one go. You just pretty much take it step by step, and that's what this kind of new frameworks are really helpful. And I feel like moving on forward, as companies are going to this more, we are in this relatively mature CI/CD sort of domain, but I still see lots of companies that still have very rudimentary software development and deployment practices, and it is very hard to establish that kind of oversight and visibility in those kind of environments, right?
Yeah.
So moving on forward is, as companies are moving on, sorry, no pun intended, moving on forward, as companies move from more rudimentary practices to more contemporary software development lifecycle and rituals, I think it will be much easier to implement those. Which kind of brings me to the issue I have with the upscaling. Not specifically salsa. I feel like salsa itself is great, but more as to this concept of deployment and production, right? So developer productivity, and by productivity, I don't mean how many hours a day you're working, but more like your dev environment, right? So how easy is it for you to operate in that environment? How easy is it for you to write, build, ship code, right? And also test. So if you think about it, developer productivity and security not necessarily go hand in hand. Because when we add more and more security hurdles, they somewhat decrease the developer productivity if they're not done well. So there is this aspect of achieving a proper oversight and a proper software supply chain requires a reduction in the developer productivity temporarily, for at least for the short span. It's going to give you benefits in the long term, but think of it, right? You have your way of doing something. Like we have our we use, let's say, Final Cut Pro to create our videos. If suddenly we switched from Final Cut Pro to Adobe products and new rituals and new ways of doing things, obviously there will be some short-term friction. It will take more time. And just apply that logic into that software development. So if you look at the salsa requirements, things like build as a code or ephemeral environment and isolated parameterless runtimes, these things are very nice to have and very secure, but at the same time, not so easy to achieve. And if you look at from a company's perspective, especially a software development company's perspective, where shipping code and releasing features is often a very high priority for folks, right? So you're reducing that and implementing security controls that are not necessarily going to give you immediate benefits, and it's not necessarily tangible benefits, right? It's somewhat intangible of what security benefits those things bring. Like you cannot directly say that, oh, I've implemented ephemeral environment and that's reducing my security risks by X amount. It's very hard to tangentially say that. And so a lot of companies see this and think that, I'm reducing the speed I'm pumping out my features. I already have so many customer requests and backlogs waiting for me. Why bother changing all this? This aspect is suddenly a challenge when it comes to making your whole build pipeline and your software supply chain more secure. So that's one of the issues I think is making the software supply chain more vulnerable, is that migration to a more safer environment is costly, not just from an actual monetary cost, but also like a developer productivity cost. Touching on the monetary cost very quickly, it also can be monetary more costly because a lot of this oversight, like 9 out of 10 companies are not going to do them themselves, right? They're going to buy a third party company like which does software composition analysis or just some kind of scan, and those kind of tools are not necessarily very cheap. So there's that aspect as well.
That was a lot, but that was very useful though. Actually, that's had some very interesting points. Jumping back like before, right? I had another thought in regards to packages. So we were looking specifically at external packages before. Now let's look at an internal package, right? So it's not just those external packages can have threat actors acting against it. We could have a malicious threat actor, an insider threat basically, who wants to add a set of malicious lines or code that basically will like give a certain type of vulnerability that can be later exploited. So that's like,
that reminds me of the SolarWinds attack. Poisoning the build. It's suddenly
so that'll also be a pretty interesting aspect, right? And having a framework to come out in the future would be really helpful in regards to that. So you have both an aspect of you looking into both the external side of things and also the internal side of things, and how you can manage both in a secure way. I think to finish it off, I'll be going over some predictions, right? I have some spicy ones for this.
Sure, let's hear.
I think it to start off with, I feel like just in general, there's just going to be way more tools and frameworks. As any new startup, any new buzzword starts to come, there'll be more tools.
And that shows we had a gap, right? We
definitely had a gap. And people are like, I can come here and solve this problem, which is good. That'll push the industry forward in resolving this issue for sure, or making us more secure, basically, and preventing some common pitfalls that can happen. And then, right, I think a big tool that surely will start to pop up in a much wider fashion, if it has already not, is like asset discovery. Because finding all the packages in all your environments is going to be a pain. Like there's no easy way to do it if you're doing it manually. And if you had to do it like for thousands of environments, that's going to be hell. Right? You surely want to look at something automated for doing a job of that scale. And finding a good asset discovery tool might be hard if you're using like multiple languages stuff. So for sure, if something in the future pops up where you can like find asset discovery across multiple environments, multiple languages, if it's not already there. I'm sorry if I missed some tool that's already there.
No, all good. I'm just gonna add on to that on top of asset discovery, I think the area we want to be targeting is that software composition analysis. What is that software made of, right? So it's not just the direct dependencies, that transitive dependencies, like dependencies of dependencies to that layer. Those kind of software composition analysis is becoming really popular. We do have quite a few big companies. I'm not gonna mention any vendors, but we see a lot of big players and big demand.
Yeah.
Like a lot of very new hot security startups are in that field. So definitely that's something going to be interesting.
Yeah. The other point I had was like automating testing in packages. Kev, do you have any points of this? Like, I knew this is surely going to be a, a point that's already been done. Like, people already automate certain amounts of security tests within their packages when they build. But how do you involve the aspect of a supply chain in that? Like,
Interesting. So is that your prediction? Like you'll see more
yeah, I'm
automating?
predicting. Yeah, I'm predicting straight up more automated tests. There's no way it's
Yeah,
physically
yeah.
going to be possible to review all the packages that are coming internally, and also these internal packages, if linking to your previous point, can use external packages which then have dependencies within it, right?
Yeah. So again, it goes back to that software composition analysis tools, and a lot of those do that. Like in Atlassian, we have Atlassian-wide a tool running that goes through like the dependencies and how these kind of automated packages work is these packages we generate a signature for the packages and pretty much look for whether the package integrity is okay, and as well as look for vulnerable versions across repositories. I think this automation, it's gonna be somewhat delegated to third parties and companies. So that's where a lot of this automation is gonna come in, because it's very hard. It's like a threat intel business, right?
Yeah.
So you wanna know which package is vulnerable, which versions of which packages are vulnerable, and that's what we're seeing a lot as well. So we have tons of tools and companies that are offering these services.
Yeah.
On top of that, like initiatives like the SIG store of OpenSSF, that's actually very interesting. So that looks into the integrity aspect of these packages and third-party libraries. So it takes the concept of certificates and signing of those certificates and pretty much implements them on that package level.
Yeah.
So those are some of the ways people are sort of automating the testing of packages. If does that answer your question?
Yeah. That answers my question and even goes into the next point I was having on like linking packages, because sometimes, as you said, integrity between packages can be lost. Like between the package that's deployed in the environment and the actual source code of the repo. So having a link via like Sigstore and stuff would be really helpful. And I've seen like recently an RFC posted by NPM in regards to that. And yeah, people are surely looking forward and moving ahead into that direction.
Cool. I think most of my predictions kind of overlap with you. The one thing I will add is going forward, we will definitely see more caution when it comes to using open source software. So it'll be very interesting to see, knowing the fact that open source software has high risk at times, but at the same time high demand. So what do you do in that high risk but high demand kind of instances, right? So that's something I do want to think a bit more on going forward in the future and see what goes on to the industry.
Yeah, that surely is going to be very interesting for sure in the future.
Cool, Surya. That was really fun. Looking at the time, we are very close to wrapping it up. So yeah, another very insightful episode, and thank you as always for all your knowledge and insights. That was very fun, and thanks to our audience for listening to us. We would very much like to hear from you on what you think is making the software supply chain so vulnerable. What point that we have mentioned resonates with you the most, and if we have missed a point that you really wanted to talk about that makes the security of supply chain so critical, please feel free to let us know in terms of comments or any way possible.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and we hope to see you in the next episode.
Bye, guys.